It's setting up my YouTube live. Um, let's see if it works this time. Oh, now I can. Hello. Okay, now it's working. Okay, hello, friends. This is I don't. I hardly ever schedule a meeting, a live meeting. Maybe I should try that. Like, announce a meeting so that people will come. But I just um, suddenly decide, hey, I'd like to do this. So I'm doing this at this time. It's 9:08 in the morning. Let's see, what day is it today? Wednesday? Let me check what the date exactly is. March 24th. Uh-oh. Okay. All right. So, okay. So I got this book. I got several books by Professor Lamsa. Let's see. Let's read up on a little bit about him, if there's anything about him. He's written. So I'm looking at Gospel Light, an indispensable guide to the teachings of Jesus and the customs of his time by George M. Lamsa, Harper and Row Publishers. Let's see. By the same author, Holy Bible from the Ancient Eastern Text, a translation, Old Testament Light, idioms in the Bible explained and a key to the original Gospels. Let's see. This was copyrighted 1936, renewed 1964. So what is this book that old? 1964? I guess so. Doesn't look that old. Let me show you what it looks like. Okay, so here's Gospel Light by George M. Lamsa, indispensable guide to the teachings of Jesus and the customs of his time. Forward. So this volume is the result of many questions asked by men and women who have attended my lectures on Aramaic. It's the language that's a cousin to Hebrew that most likely folks that were Jewish would speak natively, besides Greek, around Jesus' time. And so Jesus probably spoke Aramaic. I wonder if there's any people left that speak it. And where would they be located? So letters of inquiry also come from ministers and laymen of many Christian denominations, other faiths who have read my translation of the four Gospels from Aramaic and other books on this subject. Many of these people expressed the desire to have in writing my interpretation of the passages which I had explained in my lectures and have explained also other obscure and important passages in the gospel narrative from my knowledge of the Aramaic language and ancient Semitic customs. These constitute the background of the Old and New Testaments and the teachings of Jesus. Many lovers of the Bible who value truth more than pride and sectarian dogma are ready to welcome any light thrown on the teachings of our Lord and any suggestions which make them clearer. So St. Matthew Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. In the Gospel of Matthew, according to the Eastern text, is known as the preaching of Matthew. That is to say, Matthew's version of the life and teaching of our Lord. It is obvious that this title was given by the compiler or the scribe who assembled the scrolls together and who was himself responsible for additional material such as the birth and genealogy of Jesus. These issues were raised later. The question of the birth of a famous man always arises after he attains power and prominence. The first Christians were concerned only in what Jesus said and did, and not about where and how he was born. This and this is true of many great living religious teachers in our day. We know them and their works, but we know nothing about their birth and background, which are generally written years after they have passed away. This is truer of the Eastern people, where dates of births and deaths are not recorded and are only known in connection with important events such as wars, special taxations, persecutions, and rise and fall of rulers and kings. Yep. Believe that? Let's see. Oh, my computer's thing. Wait. Sorry. So authorship in the East is understood differently than in Western lands. A book written about the preaching of Matthew or a compilation of Matthew's writing would be known as the Book of Matthew. This is because the copyist does not consider himself an author of the material he writes or compiles. A book written by Joshua about Moses would be known as the Book of Moses, and Joshua's name would not be included in it. For example, the Book of Moses and Joshua give the details of the death and burial of Moses and Joshua. How could they have recorded their own deaths? They had written tribal records of their possessions, which the later scribe arranged in chronological order with supplementary materials after the deaths. For example, some years ago, a famous Assyrian poet composed a popular song about Ishia, father of the Assyrian patriarch who was poisoned in Persia. The song today is known as the Song of Essia, but the poet is a cousin of mine whose name is Eshu. Jesus. Moreover, the writings on the scrolls never contain the name of the author or the copyist, especially in the case of sacred literature. The difference between the Gospels are largely due to the nature of the material, oral sources, difficulties in obtaining complete sets of scrolls from which to copy, and the locality for which the text was produced. The material that would have appealed to the Jews in Judea would have been repulsive to Galileans and Syrians. This is why Mark and John omitted the issue of Jesus' genealogy in the accounts of the births. On the other hand, Matthew omitted the story of the woman in Samaria because the Jews hated the Samaritans, and a favorable account of the discourse between Jesus and a prophet and a Samaritan woman would have been repulsive to the Jews. John, however, seized the opportunity to convince the Samaritans and Gentiles that Jesus was not only seeking Jewish people, but the Gentiles. So this practice of omitting and adding material in sacred books is still continued in the East, as illustrated by Nestorian manuscripts, some of which were written in the 5th century AD and recently published by Roman Catholics, Anglicans, and Presbyterians. The books based upon these manuscripts vary according to the beliefs of those who use them. Roman Catholics omit what is against their teaching and insert what was formerly rejected by the author as a heresy. Anglicans omit the name of some Eastern fathers who denounced the formula Mary, Mother of God. And God died on the cross, stating that Mary was only the mother of Jesus and that Jesus died as a man. Presbyterians, on the other hand, print accurately from the manuscripts. The original authors, long dead, are surely not responsible for later changes made in their writings. There is no doubt that one of the apostles wrote the material which was the basis of all the gospels, and that Matthew was a writer. Writing was common at the time. Epistles were exchanged between Christians of Antioch and the apostles of Jerusalem, and between Paul and the churches in Asia Minor. Eusebius quotes Papias to the effect that Matthew wrote his gospel in Hebrew, that is, Aramaic. He further states that Matthew and John were the only apostles who left recorded comments. Tradition all over the East verifies this. Matthew's gospel was placed first when the scrolls were compiled because it was the first written document. The early Christians ought to have known which was the first document and who was its author. Had they known that, dispute would have arisen over the authorship of these gospels and would have handed it down to us written evidence. Handed down to us written evidence of dates and other facts. It must be remembered that hundreds of books were burned by pagans during the 10 persecutions when much Christian literature was destroyed. And yet the information these written writings contain was handed down orally. The so-called Q document is a pure hypothesis. The variations in the Gospels were large due to the fact that some of the scribes had no access to the new material owing to their isolation. For instance, how could an Anglican missionary in Uganda without any contact with England know about the changes of the prayer book? Okay. So this Gospel of Matthew, or the book of Matthew, or the preachings of Jesus written down by Matthew, uh, we've read up to chapter 5 in the King James version. So some of this might be similar, but what happens is this George Lamsa goes through the stories and explains the verses, and it tries to go in deep into the words, like say Nazareth. Nazareth is, I guess, is the English version of the word of a town. It says, and he came and dwelt in a city called Nazareth, that it might be fulfilled which was spoken by the prophet. He shall be called a Nazarene. That's Matthew 2:23. So Nazareth is derived from the Hebrew and Aramaic word Nazar or Nadar, to take a vow. Nazareth might have been the home of the Nazarites, who appear from time to time in Israel. They were separated from the people and lived in seclusion. They did not shave or take strong drink. Nazareth is situated a few miles south of Cana at the northern end of the plains of Esdraelon. The name of this town is not mentioned in the Old Testament. It was probably built by refugees who was who were transported by King Sargon, a Nazarene. Nazarenes or Nazarites were dedicated to God before they were born. Childless women pledged to offer their firstborn to God as a Nazarene when their prayers are answered. This is how Samuel and Samson became Nazarites. Huh? No. Okay, the town of Nazareth was not mentioned in the Old Testament, but there were Nazarenes and Nazarites that were mentioned in the Old Testament, obviously, because Samuel and Samson were Nazarites. The Nazarites were different from other people. Oh boy. Okay, there's a spam call. The Nazarites were different from other people as they lived simple lives. They were looked upon as men of God because they are dedicated to the work of God. The order of the Nazarites is still preserved in the Assyrian church. Bishops and other ecclesiastical authorities are all Nazarites. They do not shave or marry nor use strong drink. Hmm. So Nazarites are well, maybe they're not. They may not be. They may not have to be celibate, but they don't marry. Mhm. At least the generation of vipers, and it explains what vipers are, and it mightier than I, and it explains. So each verse is deeply explained or expanded. Um, so 40 stones into bread. So in what that's often used. And when the tempter came to him, he said, "If thou be the Son of God, command that these stones be made bread." That's Matthew 4:3. That's the Satan tempting Jesus. So if you're the Son of God, you should be able to turn these stones into bread. In Eastern countries, wheat is never bleached. The color of bread is brown, and when baked, the round loaves resemble stones. Hungry travelers often see these hot stones and wish they were bread. A prophet is known by his miraculous works and his predictions, which are fulfilled, and not by his doctrines. No one can be accepted as a prophet without these extraordinary gifts. When Moses was asked to return to Egypt, he wanted a sign in order to test his own power as a prophet. So he turned his staff into a serpent. In Egypt, he wonders which surpasses the works of great Egyptian. No, he into yeah. In Egypt, he wanders. He wondered. He did no. In Egypt, he did wonders. He did magical things, which surpassed the works of the great Egyptian magicians. Elijah performed miracles and was fed by a raven and other things. And so changing stones into bread would not help to soften the hearts of the people, as God had worked many miracles among them before, but they always forgot and went after other gods. So Jesus depended on his heavenly Father for spiritual help and nourishment and not for material bread. Mm. Oh, yes. And mm, I guess if you impress people by your miracle powers, they don't pay attention to the teachings, or after a while they forget about you. Hmm. Let's see. The word Galilee is derived from the Aramaic word gal, to take captive. Galute in Aramaic means captivity. Uh, hmm, Galilee of the Gentiles. Hmm. So, who- poor in pride. Okay. So, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom. Okay. Matthew 5:3. Yes, this one is kind of puzzling, or was. Let's see if this helps. So the Aramaic word roka in this case means pride. Jesus was referring to those who were proud of their ancestry and social standing, those who belonged to the nobility and the rich were reluctant to serve under others. Interesting. Mm. So maybe it should be uh, reinterpreted as blessed are the humble, the poor in pride. The blessed are those who hmm, who have managed to maintain their self cherishing at a manageable level. Maybe I don't know. How could I say that? Self esteem. Hmm. Easterners are always proud of their forefathers and race. Some people, even though poor and uncultured, are highly respected and honored because of their ancestry and are exempt from certain levies and burdens which others bear. Hmm. Many people capitalize greatly on their ancestry. Some men would rather starve than do any manual labor because their ancestors were never employed in this type of work, but were the employers. And so their pride reduces them to poverty and destitution. Interesting. Okay, so the Jews were proud of their ancestry. They were the children of Abraham, the founder of their race, and Abraham was a servant of the King, living God. Even when they were defeated and made captives, they looked down on their conquerors because they believed that Jehovah, their God, was the God of the world, and that the gods of the other races were not gods. This race had gone through many hardships and changes and its racial glory had passed. For nearly 500 years, they were living under a foreign yoke, and there was little hope for their restoration. For the restoration of Israel, the Pharisees, priests, and scribes, in order to console their hearts, dwelt a great deal on the glory of Israel in the early days. There is nothing to boast about but false racial pride. These men tried to make people believe they were too good to be ruled by foreigners, too holy to have any intercourse with other people, too proud to take orders from officials of other nations whose gods were inferior to the God of Israel. But so this admonition, this pithy saying, "Blessed are the poor in pride." So so that could be trans could be interpreted as meaning, "Blessed are those who have no racial prejudice and are tolerant," in that sense, to maybe to try to get Jews to be less racially prejudicial and more tolerant. Jesus knew that before the Jews could find peace, they must learn to be unassuming and meek. They had to be humble before they could expect toleration from their Gentile rulers. Because at that time they had Gentile rulers. I guess the Gentile rulers would be the foreign people that had captured Judea, or that would be maybe the Greeks, maybe the Romans. Well, the Greeks captured them culturally, or they tried to Hellenize them. I'm assuming there were Greeks that would be teaching people to speak Greek. I wonder if any of them tried to learn Latin. That would be the language of the rulers. If it was that the Romans ruled, or was it that even though the Romans ruled, they nevertheless spoke Greek? The mourners. Okay, so here's the next blessed verse. Verse saying, "Blessed are they that mourn, for they shall be comforted." So, in countries where wars, revolutions, and persecutions are frequent, mourning is common. One often sees women, hair cut, heads bowed down, dressed in black, and men with heads covered with black cloths, and their faces expressing deep sorrow. Even little children share in the unhappy events which constantly take place, bringing distress to their people. Joy and laughter are seldom seen and heard in their homes. Galilee was a center of insurrections. The Galileans were a warlike people. They were the descendants of Assyrians and had retained their tribal characteristics. They made repeated attempts to free Palestine from the Roman yoke, but failed. The Jews in the south did not help. Judas, the Galilean, started a revolt and gallantly fought the Roman legionnaires, but he was defeated and met with death. Is that a different Judas? Acts 5:37, or the same Judas that we know. Plato and Herod vehemently tried to stamp out these uprisings in order to win favors from the Roman emperor. Some Jewish leaders also betrayed their own people for special favors bestowed on them by Roman officials. Pilate had mingled the blood of some Galileans with their sacrifices. The Galileans mourned the death of their heroes and beloved ones, lost their lives trying to free their country from alien rule. In the new kingdom, the subjects were to rule and the rulers to become subjects. Mourners were to be made happy. Their sorrow was to be changed into joy, and the expressions were to receive everlasting punishment. These people came to Jesus and complained of the injustice and suffering which they were enduring. He cheered them by saying, "Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall rejoice. They were soon to become the citizens of the new kingdom. Joy and happiness awaited them." Oh my gosh. He's an insurrectionist. Mm. It seems like what would this new kingdom be like? Was he literally telling them that there would be a new kingdom? Mm, no, man. Maybe that's why he got sentenced to death, to be crucified, to prevent an insurrection. Mm, but then there's this verse: "Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth." Okay, isn't that similar to the first one that we read? This beatitude is an Oriental proverb still commonly used. It refers to the type of man who does not retaliate and who is free from that grasping temper which leads to disputes and quarrels, often ending in bloodshed and murder. Such men are believed in non resistance and submit to injustice even at great inconvenience. Is that like a nonviolent what is it? Nonviolent disobedience kind of movement. I'm thinking of Martin Luther King and Mahatma Gandhi. They seldom protest to the rulers of the earth, but in their applications, they always remind God of their heavy burdens. They are at last rewarded for their oppressors and persecutors. No, they are at last rewarded for their oppressors and persecutors generally perish in in wars and revolutions. It is still customary in the East. Mm. When when this George Lamsa says East, how far east is it? It's more like Southwest Asia, I guess Near East. Who knows how it's like in the Far East, as in China, and the Southeast Asia, as in India and Indonesia. and Burma, uh, hmm, Malaysia. Uh, hmm. It is still customary in the East when a man dies or is killed in war, leaving no male heir, his land is turned over to the meritorious meek. Landlords, furthermore, invariably prefer to leave their vineyards and farms to men of character who are responsible and reliable. The meek are thus ultimately blessed and rise in power and prosperity. Jesus knew of cases where revolutionary Galileans were executed by the Romans, their property confiscated and given to men who were not suspected of sedition. He here stresses the quality of meekness, which brings contentment and satisfaction. It's against the spirit of chronic restlessness, which causes disturbances and violence and violations of law. Hmm. Mm-hmm. And then he goes on to satisfaction in righteousness, which says, blessed are they which do hunger and thirst after righteousness, for they shall be filled. So, so in most Eastern countries, people are misruled by their governments. Exploitation of the poor and injustices prevail everywhere. Heavy taxes and extortion by government officials make people hunger for righteousness. To console themselves, they dream of kind kings and honest officials to supplant their harsh rulers. Judges and other government officials do not judge people by what they have done, but according to what they have in the class to which they belong. The poor are thus crushed by the injustice, and their property is often confiscated. Hmm. Mm. These men, tired of their governments, become indifferent and lose interest in political parties and reformers, and continually pray for the establishment of God's rule on earth. So, what I've read is very what is it? Very applicable to what's happening today. Oh, very timely, you could say. Well, it's similar things are happening now everywhere, I guess. Well, the last part talking about political parties, people are becoming indifferent and losing interest in political parties and reformers. And, and so people are praying for the establishment of God's rule on the earth. I'll stop here. I could go on, but I guess it's time to get back to regular living, you know, stuff to do. Go, gotta go to work. So that's the gospel light, an indispensable guide to the teachings of Jesus and the customs of his time. Uh, his other books include the Holy Bible, the Old Testament Light, idioms in the Bible explained, and the key to original gospels. But there's another one that he wrote that I got here. Let's see, Gospel Light, and here's New Testament Light. So maybe this one is kind of like this one, but it includes. So this has got the four Gospels. So this would have maybe the Gospels, but also the Acts, Epistles, and Revelations. So maybe this one's more complete. Maybe well, the same thickness, but maybe he doesn't go as deeply into the Gospel. Let's look at the table of contents. Uh, hmm. Yeah. Let's see. St. Luke. The, so it goes up to page 171 is the Gospel of John. Mhm. Wow. Hmm. Oh, wait a minute. John. Okay, here's John. This is all John. Then it starts to go into Acts. So here's the four Gospels are covered with only this much, and then the rest is like Acts and letters and stuff, epistles, Revelation. So this one goes into more detail into the four Gospels. So that's good. So, but I'd like to know how did he acquire his translations? So I could go. Let's see. Oh, what I could go is do this. I could go to google.com or maybe bing.com. I want to try to use Bing a little more often. So let's see. George Lamsa. The George Lamsa. In Wikipedia, it says he was born in 1892 and died 1975. He was Assyrian. Hmm. He is native Aramaic speaker and translated the Aramaic Peshitta Old and New Testaments into English. Also, there is a Peshitta in Aramaic Old and New Testament, but where did those come from? He popularized the claim that the Assyrian Church of the East, the claim of the Assyrian Church of the East that the New Testament was written in Aramaic and then translated into Greek, contrary to academic consensus. So he might be considered controversial. So Lamsa was a member of the Assyrian Church of the East, a Syriac church that uses the Peshitta as the Bible. Some of the modern Assyrian people speak a modern form of the classical Syriac language called Northeastern Neo-Aramaic. The Peshitta was written in classical Syriac, a dialect of Middle Aramaic, which is in turn a Semitic language. The language spoken in the first century would have been Old Aramaic, like the Judeo-Aramaic language, while the ancient Aramaic, like Biblical Aramaic, was used in Old Testament times. So Lamsa was a strong advocate of a belief traditionally held by part of that church that the Aramaic New Testament of the Peshitta was the original source text and that the Greek texts were translated from it. So, according to Lamsa, Aramaic was the colloquial and literary language of Palestine, Syria, Asia Minor, Mesopotamia from the 4th century BC to the 9th century AD. This view of the Assyrian church regarding the language of the New Testament is rejected by mainstream scholarship, but Lamsa's views won support among some churches, such as The Way. Lamsa further claimed that while most of the Old Testament was written in Hebrew, the original was lost and the present Hebrew version, the Masoretic text, was retranslated from the Peshitta. Lamsa produced his own translation of the Bible in the form of the Holy Bible from ancient Eastern manuscripts, which is commonly called the Lamsa Bible. And the Aramaic word for camel is written identically to the word for rope. So, according to Lamsa, Matthew 9:24 should be correctly translated as it is easier for a rope to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter into the kingdom of God. Well, that would make more sense, I would say. Other things. Um, hmm. There's a what critics of Lamsa say that why he might be wrong. Oh, here it talks about Neil Douglas Klotz, former chair of the mysticism group of the American Academy of Religion, defends Lamsa and points out that the differences between first century Palestinian Aramaic and the Syriac of Peshitta are minimal concerning the roots of keywords that Jesus must have used. And and then the Christian Evangelical Apologetics Research Ministry, Christian researchers asserted in a published review that several of Lamsa's theological positions and interpretations were not supported by the Bible. The review concludes by saying, blah, blah, blah. And Neil Douglas Klotz makes the case that one needs to take into account both the way of knowing epistemology and psychology of ancient Semitic languages in order to properly interpret the words of a prophetic figure. Hmm. And his works include, these. Did the Jews kill Jesus? Hmm. Was Jesus an Essene? A brief course in the Aramaic language. That might be a good one to look for. New Testament light. So, um, uh, so New Testament light was put out in 1988. Holy Bible in 1985. Where's the Gospels? Gospel light, 1936. Wow. So 1892 to 1936. Hmm. That would make him 44 years old when he put out Gospel Light. Okay, so um, so now we know the rest of the story. So I better get going for sure. Okay, so let's see how do I get out of this. Oops. Whoa. Okay, I stopped sharing and I flip this over to show it. So, oh man, let's see. Ah, there we go. So, boy, did we learn a little bit, but still more to learn. And so, I'd like to learn Aramaic and become an Aramaic scholar. Mm, mm. Okay, thank you.